So on today's Mapify Your KPIs webinar series, we're going to focus on visual storytelling with maps. And to do that, we brought in a top expert, a heavy hitter in the data visualization world, Mr. Alberto Cairo. And I'll go ahead and introduce him in a minute. Just wanted to go through a couple slides to level set why we're here and what we're doing with this Mapify Your KPI. My name's Ryan Goodman. I'm actually one of the co-founders of CMaps Analytics. And so we're hosting these Mapify Your KPIs webinars as a way to help distribute knowledge to our business intelligence and enterprise community and ecosystem, really with the goal to help drive maps and location intelligence as a critical part of your BI strategy. What we do at CMaps Analytics is help with execution. We build technology solutions that allow you to build and design maps. Obviously, in today's webinar, we're not really focused on the tools and technology that we build. The focus really is on why maps are important and how to effectively use those to tell stories. I originally met Alberto through a podcast. You heard me mention the podcast, which is Analytics on Fire, a podcast that myself and Miss Miko Yuck have created, akin to what we're doing with Mapify Your KPIs, right, of helping analysts, BI practitioners, technologists really drive more value and learn more about business intelligence. Well, we're doing the same thing with Mapify Your KPIs. So some of our other broadcasts and webcasts have focused on other areas around location intelligence. And this is kind of the spectrum when I say location intelligence. And as I mentioned, today we're really focused on the visualization aspect, the actual maps themselves. As I mentioned, to do that, we brought in Alberto Cairo to kind of drive some of the burning questions that I know many of you may have when it comes to maps. So with that, welcome Alberto, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey Ryan, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Alberto, obviously I've got two of your books here, and actually even before we interviewed you on the podcast, I had a copy of The Functional Art. One of the great things around data visualization that we've seen in the last 8 years is just experts like yourself bring amazing information and education kind of to the masses. Maybe you want to spend a little, just a moment to introduce yourself and what you do, and maybe talk, even talk a little bit about the books.
Sure. Well, first of all, I don't consider myself an expert on anything. That's the first thing that I would like to say, because I am a journalist, and actually in the introduction of the second book, The Truthful Art, I basically joke that I have made a profession of being an amateur on almost anything. So I like to borrow knowledge from tons of different areas, domains, from journalism, graphic design, statistics, cartography, storytelling, business analytics, etc. Blend it all together and then transform all that knowledge, process it and digest it, and then present it in a way that can be understood by people who want to communicate effectively using graphics of different kinds. That's what I do. I have a career in journalism, so I am a professor right now. I'm a professor at the University of Miami, in Miami, Florida. Have been here since 2012. I am the night chair in visual journalism down here, and I'm also the director of the visualization program of the University of Miami's Center for Computational Science. So I collaborate with scientists and business people, etc., to communicate effectively. And I teach my students at the university, at the School of Communication, how to create information graphics and interactive data visualizations with the goal, again, of communicating effectively. But I began my career not as a professor. I began my career in 1997 as a journalist and news designer in several newspapers in Spain, namely La Voz de Galicia. Then I went to Diario 16, then I went to El Mundo, and I was at El Mundo for 5 years. And then I moved to the US. I also went to Brazil for 3 years. I was the director of infographics of Global magazines. Global is the largest group of communication in Latin America. And for a while, I was the director of infographics for the magazines of the group. And then right after that is when I came to the University of Miami and became a professor. And yeah, as you said, I mean, I wrote those two books, The Functional Art and The Truthful Art, which can be read separately because they cover different materials. Both of them are obviously books about visualization, but The Functional Art focuses more on explanation graphics, so how to tell a story using illustrations, maps, charts, diagrams. And The Truthful Art focuses a little bit more on data thinking, so how to think critically about data, and then how to present those data effectively using statistical charts, maps, and how to explore it also. So they both are books about visualization, but they cover different grounds. So that's basically it, I guess.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because, and I know we talked about this on the podcast, is we've seen, in your world doing, editorial and information graphics, and then in our world, being in business intelligence, you have a lot of technicians, data hungry analysts who, traditionally, were using very basic, kind of rudimentary reporting tools to try to articulate what's happening in a company. And so this whole notion around visual storytelling and data visualization has really kind of exploded. And, as I mentioned, at least when I got started in the world of BI, literally there was like one or two books on the topic of visualization. Yeah, it's like Tufte or
Stephen Few, Naomi Robbins, William Cleveland, all the early
business books, right? That maybe only mention a little bit about visualization. So it's been amazing to see just the caliber of material out there, and certainly your books are awesome. Even for a business intelligence profession.
Yeah, I think that it is related in part to the fact that the tools that we use today to conduct analysis, and I'm not an expert on business analytics. That's a very important thing to remember. I focus more on how to present the story effectively. But the tools that we use for both kinds of work are very similar. And one amazing thing about tools is that they are becoming easier to use than ever, and in some cases they are even free, right? Or they're getting cheaper, or they are even becoming free. So, for example, in the world of journalism, we have seen a huge adoption of open source technologies like programming languages in like D3 or R, etc. And then even tools that are not open source. In some cases, they are free. So you go, for example, Tableau has a free version, Tableau Public, Power BI by Microsoft, that you can download it for free and then use it. So there's plenty of tools out there that you can use and explore to analyze and then visualize and present your data effectively. And I think that this is part of the reason visualization is becoming more popular, that the tools are easier to use and more accessible. And then being able to put those visualizations online attracts many people, many readers, at least in the world of journalism, mainly because we human beings are a visual species. So whenever we see data mapped spatially, it really attracts our eye. It really drags us into the story and makes us reader, right? If you present a story just made of text, right, you may read it or not, but if you, besides telling the story using words, you combine those words with different kinds of visuals, a video, a photograph, or an interesting looking infographic or data visualization, suddenly your story becomes more engaging and much more attractive. And people who do analytics in media, newspapers, magazines, websites, etc., they are seeing this effect. It also happens in social media. If you put a tweet with no image, that will attract less people, and it will be less retweeted than a tweet that includes some sort of visual, all right? And apparently, infographics and visualizations work really well also in social media, as far as I have heard. So I'm not surprised that we have experienced this boom in the last decade or so.
Yeah, and social media, for some reasons, for business people, infographics and visuals really get the most retweets, and then in consumer life, for some reason, people love selfies. So that I don't.
Yeah, that's right. Perhaps we should invent the visualization selfie.
There you go. Now we're on to something.
Yeah.
As far as maps goes, I mean, and you mentioned some open source, some great open source visualization library, like D3, and obviously on the mapping front, you have open source now like Leaflet.
Yeah, you have Leaflet. You have Quantum GIS, QGIS. There are even tools that are not open source, but they can be freely used. Like, you have CartoDB, for example, which is an excellent tool. I don't know. There are so many options. Lately, for example, I have been experimenting with an online free tool called Quadrigram. It begins with a Q, quadrigram.com, which is an excellent visualization tool that includes mapping capabilities, and it's excellent. I mean, it lets you do a lot of the stuff. It's really advanced, it's easy to use, but it's very deep. So, I'm really impressed by all these tools.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and CartoDB is another one that we use pretty heavily also.
Yeah.
So what is it though, about mapping that really gets consumers or even business people fired up? I mean, is there something that you've been able to pinpoint why people are so drawn to maps?
Well, I mean, in part, I think that it has to do with the fact that maps are a graphic form that is very familiar to us, right? So if you compare, for example, maps to statistical charts, statistical charts have a lifetime of 200 and something years. We could say, although we should introduce some nuances here when saying this, but we could say that statistical charts were basically invented by William Playfair at the end of the 18th century, right? He was borrowing ideas from cartography. He said, well, we have cartography that is basically, creating a map consists of mapping points using longitude and latitude over a grid. And when Playfair, who was basically a genius, said, what about if instead of plotting longitude and latitude, we plot, for example, time on the x-axis and a quantity on the y-axis? And he came up with the idea of creating line charts and bar charts, right? So line charts, bar charts, and other kinds of statistical charts, they only have a life of 200 and something years. But cartography, it's something that has been with humanity basically forever. I mean, the history of cartography goes back, thousands and thousands of years. So first of all, maps are very familiar to us. We have been dealing with maps for a very, very long time. That's the first thing. So they're very familiar graphic form for everybody. And the second thing is that maps can be useful, and we will talk about this later, to spot patterns in the data and connections. That's another reason why maps can be really powerful, and they are so attractive. And third of all, and more importantly, because maps also have, I believe, a certain aesthetic appeal that attracts many people. They have like a pictorial appeal, right? They are a visual representation of a spatial region, of a geographical area. And in some sense, they work as beautiful illustrations, right? When you create, for example, a dashboard, or when you create a poster, an infographics poster, and that poster is only made of statistical charts, it may look beautiful, it may be incredibly informative, but suddenly when you put a map in there, right, the display becomes more attractive for some reason. And I think that it has to do with the pictorial qualities of the map, that it works with an illustration, as an illustration. I have experienced this myself whenever I see, for example, a multi-component display, a multi-component infographic, for example. The first thing that grabs my attention is the map. If it has a map, that's the first thing that I look at, the map. Right? If it has an illustration, some sort of pictorial illustration, I will also look at that. I usually don't focus on the statistical charts first, right? So I think that those are the things that explain why maps are so popular.
Just the nature of a map is obviously going to draw your eye. I mean, like on this example, and this is one you created, right? I've composed it a little bit different, right? But I mean,
yes, yeah. This is a map that I made with my team in Brazil. This was back in 2010. That's the reason why the text is in Portuguese. So this is a map of electoral results in the Brazilian presidential elections. There were like 3 candidates. And we decided to combine a choropleth map. The choropleth map is the map that uses different shades of color to encode the data. Combine that choropleth map with a radar chart, right, that you can see right now on the left, although in the original graphic it was on the right. And it worked quite well. I mean, it got, you know, good responses. People liked the display. And I think that it was because of the combination of the map, which is a very familiar graphic form, with the radar chart, which is a very unfamiliar graphic form. And it's actually a graphic form that I have only used, I believe, twice in almost 20 years as an infographics designer. Because it's usually not a very effective way of presenting data, the radar chart. So actually using this slide is a little bit dangerous because it may encourage people to start using radar charts like for everything, right? And what makes this radar chart appropriate in this particular case, I believe, at least in my opinion, is that the radii of the radar chart are positioned according to the geography, according to the map. So for example, the labels on the upper right corner of the radar chart are correspond to the states in northeastern Brazil, and the radii, the labels at the bottom of the radar chart, those correspond to the states that are in the south of Brazil, right? So and the combination worked really well in this specific case, I believe.
Gotcha. So the fact that if you're looking at the radar chart of the upper right has, you know, higher values, so we can
it has higher values, higher vote for the candidate of the leftist party. That is the reason why the red line seems to be pushing upwards, right? So the northeastern states in Brazil are poorer than the southern states in Brazil, and they tend to vote more for leftist candidates. That is what the radar chart is showing.
That's very cool.
But as I said before, this is a very, very specific case. I don't encourage people to use radar charts. I actually wrote an article a while ago in my website, thefunctionalart.com, that was titled something like "Radar Charts, Avoid Them 99% of the time," or something like that. Right? So it's only 1% of cases that they may work, right?
I'm going to go to another example, and I pulled these examples out of your book. You know, when you're citing examples of other people's work, you actually provide some of the URLs. So I was actually able to go and explore some of the maps from the book. But is there like a series of steps that you use to find the right map or the right type of map?
Well, I outline those steps in the book itself, where you get the examples from in the Truthful Art. But I don't really have like a set, you know, series of steps that I take. But what I do when I'm going to create a map is, first of all, and these examples that you chose, by the way, illustrate this idea really well. These are, you know, maps created by places like the Berliner Morgenpost, the one on the upper right corner, and other media. The one at the bottom is also by the Berliner Morgenpost. So there are excellent examples. So the main question that you need to ask yourself when you are thinking about using a map is if the map actually accomplishes what it's supposed to accomplish. All right. So when should we use a map? Well, you can use a map, first of all, to locate places. So for instance, if you're going to display data that is related to places that you believe that a huge portion of your audience is unfamiliar with, then it's worth you need to use a map just to show where those places are, right? That would be one case in which using a map is appropriate. The other case, which is actually the case that these maps illustrate really well, is we should use a data map when there is some sort of a spatial pattern that you want to highlight, a pattern of concentration, a pattern of different kinds. In those cases, you need to use a map. If you don't have those two cases, for instance, if you're going to display data that pertains to places that your audience is very familiar with, and there is not a specific geographic pattern worth highlighting, perhaps you should not use a map. You should use a completely different graphic form. You could use a bar graph or any other kinds of graphic, right? So the map can be, certainly the map has aesthetic value and has aesthetic power. It will bring people into your visualization, but that is not the only reason you should use a map. The map needs to have some sort of purpose. It cannot just be decoration, right? So that's the main question, or the main series of questions that I ask myself whenever I'm thinking about using a map. So does this map have more value other than just being a mere illustration on the page, right? Does it add anything meaningful to the infographic by highlighting, for example, geographic patterns in the data? That's when you need to use a map.
Perfect. Yeah, I mean, that I couldn't have said that better, right? I mean, many times when I go in, at least to customers, and we're doing, business intelligence type workshops, and we talk about, and in fact, it kind of alludes us to the next slide around, what type of map to choose. And I'm sure you're familiar with that discussion where one of the struggles that people have is what type of chart to use, and then once I've decided that there is a pattern, and the geography, where things are located is important to tell the story, then now I'm having the conversation of, okay, now what kind of map am I going to show?
What kind of map to use, yes. So, well, first of all, the examples that you chose here from my book were just created for the purposes of illustrating the main kinds of data maps that exist, but the data is completely fake, and it's actually a joke. It's very important to remember this because, as you can see, reading the labels, it says percentage of people who ate at least one serving of boiled octopus last year. So this is obviously a joke. And the reason why I use boiled octopus as an example for my fake data is that I was born in northwestern Spain in a region called Galicia, in the upper right corner of Spain, and boiled octopus is one of the main, traditional dishes over there. So if you ever go to northwestern Spain, to Galicia, just order boiled octopus, and I believe that you're going to enjoy it quite a lot. So anyway, so I created these maps just as a joke, but at the same time, as I said before, to illustrate some very common kinds of data maps. And the ones that I use more commonly are the choropleth map and the proportional symbol map. Those are the ones that I use most commonly. The dot map can be used as well to spot specific locations or concentration of events, relative concentration of events over a geographic area. But the most common kinds of maps available in most software tools are the choropleth map and the proportional symbol map. The choropleth map is usually used to display a normalized data, so percentages, rates, things like that, right? Relative to an area, which could be a region, could be a province, could be a district, or something like that. Yeah, but the choropleth map works better for normalized data, percentages, rates, etc. And the proportional symbol map is usually used to display raw data, to display actual counts of things, right? Obviously, you can combine both on the same display. So, for instance, if you're going to display, let's say, I don't know, unemployment, right? So you could create a proportional symbol map to show the total number of unemployed people all over Spain, and then on the side you can put a choropleth map to show the percent of people who are unemployed in Spain. So the discussion could go much further than that, and actually there's a whole chapter about maps in the truthful art, in which I go a little bit deeper into those ideas. But this is basically these are the elementary principles that we use in these kinds of cases.
Yeah, and I actually really enjoyed that in the book, the chapter on maps and around choropleths and the different ways to normalize the data. It's funny, I actually I took your book back to our development team, right? Because and I forget the name of the algorithm we use to normalize data for our choropleths, but I actually went back and said, hey guys, there's different ways to look at a choropleth or to use color.
There are different ways also. So a choropleth map, a key discussion in the chapter is how to classify the data. Because in choropleth maps, you need to create classes. You need to create beans of the data, right? Like from 0 to 10, from 11 to 20, and there are different ways in which you can do that, right? The most basic way is to divide the data up evenly, right? As I said before, from 0 to 10, from 11 to 20, so equal size beans, right? But in some cases, that is not the most appropriate way of doing that, because perhaps your data set, the distribution of your data set is not normal, it's skewed somehow, and the way you classify the data needs to reflect that, right? So the beans cannot be equal size. They need to have differing sizes, right? So yeah, I got into a little bit of depth explaining different kinds of very elementary techniques on how to classify the data. And let me say another thing that is very, very important. The discussion about how to do data maps in my book, in The Truthful Art, it's quite elementary. And if you really, really want to learn about all these techniques in depth, there is an excellent book that I usually recommend to my students by an author called Terry Slocum. And I believe that the title is, I actually can look it up very, very quickly to give you the specific name because I love recommending books, great books. And so Terry Slocum's book is called Slocum. Just give me 1 second, sorry.
Oh yeah, no worries.
I'm actually looking at it on Amazon. It's Thematic Cartography and Geo-Visualization. It's an excellent book about cartography. This is extremely geeky and very technical, but it's one of the, I believe that it's one of the Bibles of mapping. And then also a book titled How Maps Work. That's another excellent source for mapping. So How Maps Work is by Alan McEachran, who is a famous cartographer. And these are all books that I have used myself to inform my own work in the past and to learn more about how to use maps. And obviously they were sources of inspiration for my own writing later on when I wrote The Truthful Art. But if you want to really, really go deep into mapping, I would recommend not just read the chapter in my book, just go to these other books because you will learn a lot.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for the recommendations. And I'll make sure, I'll probably get those books from you after the webinar, and I'll make sure that on the recording page we'll list those as recommended readings.
Understandable. It's written for the general public, titled How to Lie with Maps by Mark Monier. And that's a very fun book. It's short. It's only 200 pages long. It's a good introduction to cartography too. So if you read those 3 books, I believe that you will have a very good understanding of thematic cartography, of thematic mapping, of data maps, basically.
But part of the power of the map is to be able to bring information or data from different sources that are unrelated and then view those things together on a map. And that's one of the things that makes maps so powerful. But is there any recommendations around maybe the science of data visualization as far as like how much is too much information to put on a map?
Well, it's a discussion that is based on very subjective judgments. But I think that you need to make basically a very honest evaluation on your own design when you are creating the graphic. And if you start feeling that your map starts looking cluttered just because you're overlaying so many different kinds of variables, right? Perhaps it is the time to actually separate those variables, right? So I mentioned before, for example, the difference between choropleth maps and proportional symbol maps. And in some cases, I saw people overlaying a proportional symbol map and a choropleth map. So they put the color regions, and then on top of that, they put the bubbles of the proportional symbol map. And perhaps that may work in some cases if the map is not very detailed and intricate, but in some cases the end result will be a map that will be completely unreadable. And in those cases it will be better to actually separate the maps. Do one map, then do the other map, right? There is an approach, a strategy in visualization called small multiples that basically consists of using maps or graphics of the same kind and then put them side by side rather than trying to cram all the data onto a single display. You basically divide the data up into different smaller displays and then you put them side by side to facilitate comparison or seeing relationships, right? So approaches like that, techniques like that can be really, really helpful also in mapping. So again, if you feel that it looks cluttered, or if your readers, when you do the testing, if you do any testing, readers tell you that they cannot really spot any pattern or trend in the data just because your map is so cluttered, perhaps you should think about creating more than one map.
It's along the lines of the advice that we give, because so many times, Alberto, we'll get a customer that says, all right, I've got 350,000 customers or stores or mostly assets, right? I mean, a company is not going to have 350,000 stores.
Yeah. But you can also aggregate the data. So for instance, if you're going to have like 300,000 customers, if you try to plot that on a map using a dot map, you will probably see nothing. It will be just an ocean of black dots. Well, what you can do is to basically aggregate the data and per region or by area, and then create a proportional symbol map, right? Plotting the number of customers using bubbles of different sizes. So that's one way of aggregating the data. So aggregating the data will be another way of making the map clearer.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And along kind of those lines, and you touched on this a little bit, but one of the things that we've seen over time, at least in the BI world, is different trends, right? And I think those trends are obviously influenced by, what we see and use in our kind of consumer lives, right? So for a long time, BI reports and dashboards, they had to have pie charts, right? And then at some point along the lines, once we had interactivity, we had to have these moving...
Everything needed to be interactive, yeah.
Like moving speedometers. And now when you look at any of the BI or reporting tools, everything has or had the, Google map or an Esri map or, some type of map.
People, as I said before, people love maps, and one of the reasons they want to see maps in dashboards and other kinds of displays is because maps look beautiful and inviting. So I kind of understand that. The thing is that there's a key idea in both my books. There's a whole reason why the first book is titled The Functional Art, but this is an idea that permeates both books, which is that a visualization is something that should be created with some sort of purpose in mind. And the purpose, one of the purposes could be to attract people to the information. That's a very important purpose, obviously. But there should be something else, like displaying the data in a certain way to enable seeing patterns, trends in the data. So you need to think about the purpose of the graphic that you're going to create. And in some cases, the map is not the answer. A map is not the answer. A chart may be the answer. As I mentioned before, just to repeat my own idea that I mentioned earlier, a map is useful when you need to locate, or when you need to help people locate certain places that may be unfamiliar to them, or when there is some sort of geographical pattern worth highlighting. Those are the main purposes of the map. There may be others, but those are the main ones. If you don't have that, if none of those cases apply, perhaps the map is not the answer. Perhaps you need another kind of display. So we need to think rationally about how we create visualizations. Not every decision should be based on our own personal preferences or personal tastes, right? We need to think about the visualization a little bit critically. Although, as I said before, the aesthetic level of a visualization is extremely important. It should not be the only one worth considering.
Leads me to my next question, and I know you also touch on this in the book a little bit around, misusing maps, right, or elements of maps to where you're just wasting space, right? And I know you talk a little bit about even using choropleths and, some of the challenges, right, and what your eye is drawn to based on the size, size of elements on the chart, or, is there, maybe you want to touch on that and maybe any other kind of pitfalls that people run into in misusing?
Yeah, I discussed some of the most elementary pitfalls, mistakes that people make. And when I say people, I talk about myself. There is something that I discuss at the end of the book, saying that when I highlight a problem in a visualization or, critique some sort of a mistake in a graphic, it's usually because I have made that same mistake myself in the past, right? And there are many mistakes that people make that we make when using maps, right? For instance, using the wrong projection, and this is pervasive in the online world, right? So a map is usually a 2D, a flat representation of an object that is not two-dimensional but three-dimensional, right? A map is a two-dimensional representation of a sphere. So in order to transfer a sphere onto a flat surface, we need to project that sphere onto that surface. And cartographers and mathematicians have been using different kinds of techniques based on geometry and mathematics to do that, right? There are certain mathematical techniques. So there are different kinds of projections, right? And I discuss some of them in the book. There are cylindrical projections, so you project the sphere inside a cylinder onto a cylinder, or flat projections, or a conic projection. So there's different kinds of projections. And for every kind of map that you need to create, for any area that that you want to display on a map, there are certain projections that work better and certain projections that don't work well at all, right? And what the most elementary mistake that all cartographers that I know about go crazy about when they see it is to use the Mercator projection, which is a very famous projection, to design world maps. And I don't want to go into the details, but the Mercator projection, the problem with that kind of projection is that it distorts the size of areas that are far from the equator, right? So, for example, in a Mercator projection, Greenland looks as big as Brazil, when Greenland is actually much smaller than Brazil. But the problem is that Greenland is so close that it gets distorted. It gets like overblown in terms of size, right? So, and that's just the most elementary mistake. There are many others that can be made when using projections, right? And for every area, there are 2 or 3 projections that are more appropriate than other projections. But there are many other kinds of mistakes. So, for example, when classifying data, like as I explained before, when creating choropleth maps, perhaps you should use a certain method of classification, of creating the bins of the data, right? As I said before, equal size bins perhaps are not the answer for that specific kind of map. Or using the rainbow color palette, right? So and I believe that the example that you're displaying right now uses a rainbow color palette, right? It's a color palette that uses all the colors of the rainbow, from blue to green to yellow to orange to red. This is a bad idea, and there's actually research. This is very common in science, by the way. Scientists, for some reason, love the rainbow color palette, but it has been shown repeatedly in experiments that the rainbow color palette can be highly misleading. And the answer for these kinds of maps is basically pure and simple common sense. If your data is continuous, meaning it goes from 0 to 100, and the data is continuous, use a continuous color palette. So you perhaps use just one single color and play with the shades of that color, right? You choose red, and then you go from light red to dark red, or from orangey red to deep, almost black red, right? That is much more appropriate for this kind of map, right, than the rainbow color palette. And well, there are many other little things, little mistakes, pitfalls that we usually fall into when we're creating maps. And I discuss them in the chapter, obviously, but these are the most common ones, I would say.
Yeah, and for the folks who are, especially around projections, that was one thing that you covered really, really well and kind of simplified it, right? Because that's
quite a lot. Yeah.
Like if I go in, talking about projections in front of business intelligence folks, usually they kind of their eyes glass over, right? But really good.
But it can be explained clearly, and you don't need to go into the details, right? Like the equations that are used to create all those kinds of projections. I don't know those equations myself, but projections can be explained clearly, right? And you can give specific advice. So you could say, actually in the book, I have a table in which I say, if you want to plot this kind of area, these are 3 or 4 projections that may work, right? So you can give specific advice, and people can take that advice and take that advice as a starting point, and I think that is helpful.
Yeah, one of the stories that I always tell people when I'm going in and presenting best practices around maps, and this has become my new example of what not to do. But one of the stories I always tell around using geography or using choropleths or thematic maps like this is that one time I was on a phone with a BI developer, and the manager was on the phone, and he was demonstrating choropleth map. Everything was labeled, and it was really hard to see certain states. And so the manager said, "Let me look at Maryland," and the developer didn't know where Maryland was. Right?
Yeah, because it's very difficult to see, and perhaps you cannot locate it.
Yeah, and he wasn't familiar with the geography. So to your point, I always kind of preach this message around knowing your users, and you cover this in the book also, right? Knowing your users, knowing if your target audience is familiar with the geography, and if they're not,
that's really important.
The labels and maybe even search, right? The mechanism to be able to know the geography. So
perhaps even combining the map with other kinds of graphic forms, right? So you're showing, again, I don't know, unemployment or temperatures, average temperatures all over the United States. Perhaps you should not plot the data just using a map, just on a map. perhaps the map can be the entry point to the display, to the dashboard, but then you can plot the same data onto a table or a bar chart, etc. So people will have like two ways to look at the data, right? The map to give them the geographic patterns if they exist, and then the bar chart or table to being able to see the ranking of temperatures all over the United States, right? So this is a strategy that I encourage my students to apply whenever it is possible. And it works quite well in interactive graphics, right? So if you want to enable different kinds of tasks, you may need to plot your data more than once with different kinds of graphic forms, because each one of them will facilitate a certain specific seeing a specific story or accomplish a specific task. Maps are useful for some things. Charts are useful for different kinds of things. So perhaps you just need to begin with the same data and show it in different ways, in different angles.
Was there any thoughts or comments around using 3D, and I guess in general, around visualization?
Yeah, well, I guess that as everything in visualization, it depends on the context. As a general rule, this is like radar charts, right? Avoid them 99% of the time, as I mentioned before. In general, I discourage people using 3D effects in data maps and in data charts, particularly if they are static. It is a different thing if the graphic is interactive. So, for example, if you're plotting several variables and you make your chart 3D, but then you let me rotate the chart so I can get a side view, a front view, a top view, etc., then the 3D effect may make sense, right? I guess that it depends on the context. But in general, I don't do 3D charts and 3D maps at all.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you for answering that. And that kind of leads us toward the end so that, if other people have questions, they can ask them. But obviously, this has been an incredible discussion around, around mapping and best practices. What's the best way for people to, reach you? Obviously, we have the book. Are you doing any workshops or anything like that?
Yeah, I'm doing certain talks in different places, and I usually announce them in my website, in thefunctionalart.com. And there's a tab that says speaking and consulting, something like that. And I have my calendar in there. So yeah, I am constantly doing talks and workshops, in some cases even online courses. And people can reach out to me through Twitter, for example, or even email. My email is really easy to find online. So, and it usually takes me a while to reply, just because I get a ton of email, but I usually reply. So I do my best to reply to everybody that sends me an email.
Wanted to thank you for joining us and sharing your expertise. I know you downplayed me calling you an expert, but I mean, really, anybody who reads these books would definitely find your expertise extremely valuable. I know that I have, and I've been doing maps for a long time. So
really appreciate that. It's flattering. Thank you.